have your attention, please. We're going to get started. All right, Dr. Bill has a presentation for the board. Let me explain how this is going to work. From the very first Rules Committee, the public is welcome to attend and listen, but there'll be no audience participation, no questions, anything like that. Dr. Bill and Jim are going to, the Rules Committee can, ask anything they want. Questions as long as they want, but there'll be no audience participation. Same thing we've done from the very beginning. Let's get going.
Okay, thank you. Good to be here. So, there's three topics I want to cover based on the viewing of the prior Rules Committee meetings. The first thing will be, at the last meeting, there was a document circulated called the Kinney County Critical Period Management Plan, Moras Springs. So I'm going to go through that. And then as a result of that review, I'll talk about what I think you might consider as a committee on a technical basis of how you would go about establishing thresholds if you want to go down that path. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion in the last couple meetings about the 2015 iTrace study. So I'm going to go through that and talk about how that is relevant or not relevant. So the document that was circulated last time included a table that was labeled average spring flow normal conditions for each month, without really explaining what that meant. And there was another table in the document that had monthly 4-stage thresholds and triggers, actions that would reductions of pumping essentially. And there would be pumping reductions, for each stage. So this is the cover of the document with the goals of the plan and the table. And the key things here are what they labeled average spring flow with some numbers in CFS. I assume it doesn't. It's not labeled that, but I assume that's what it is. And then it notes that the average spring flow is calculated from monthly data from 1966 to 2019. And there was no explanation of why that time period was chosen. So basically what I did is I plotted these average spring flows that are listed in the document against each month, so you can see how it rises and falls.
Hey, Bill, it might just be me, but could you speak up just a little
Oh,
bit?
I'm sorry. So this is the average that was in the table. I calculated averages from 66 to 19, it comes out a little different. And then I took the average of the full record of 1940 to 2022, and they're consistently lower than what's in the document. Then there were these 4 stages where it would trigger action if, as you go down the table, very similar to the EAA, which unfortunately a lot of people try and apply in other places. So what I did is I took the data that was in my Tech Memo 16 from back in June and did a daily flow analysis organized by month. And I used over 5,000 data points, and you can see how they were split out by each month. And what I did is I plotted them what's called a box and whisker plot. And I wanted to go through this to make sure we understand what this means. There's each month, there's 400 or plus or minus points. And so the top 10%, the highest 10% are expressed up here. The 90th percentile means there's 10% of the values above that. At the other extreme, the lowest values are down here. Where'd my mouse go? The lowest 10% are down here. So that's the 10 percentile. That means 10% are below that level. This middle bar is the average right here. And so between the 67th and 33rd percentile, that's where most of the data are occurring. So this basically allows you to look at the distribution in any given month of what the daily spring flows were by month. And this is in that report from June that's available on the Google Drive. So when you plot all those up for each month, it looks like this. So you can see the spring flow maxes out in June and then again in October on average. And the lowest flows are represented down here at the bottom, and the highest flows are represented up here at the top. So having these percentiles is important because it gives you some understanding of what's the probability of any particular flow for any given month. And there's a table in the report that summarizes the 10th, 33rd, 50th, the mean, the 67th, and the 90th for each month. So this is instructive because you can see the median is the exact middle. The average is the average of all the numbers. The median is typically lower than the average. So when you're picking the median, half the points are higher than that, half of them are lower than that. The mean is higher because the high flows skew the result. So if you're looking at it from a statistical standpoint, the median is a better measure of that. So when you plot up the 4 stages in terms of their percentile, the blue line represents stage 1. Well, you can see that between 60 and 70% of the time, you would be in what the document calls the critical period. The highest reduction would be associated with stage 4. That's occurring mostly in the 30 and 40 range, but in August, you'd be in that 4th stage about 50% of the time. So then I plotted up, using the daily records, I just plotted up how often you'd be in these critical periods and what the pumping reduction would be as a percent of historic as defined in the document. So in zone 1, the 45% reduction there on the left would occur 35 or so percent of the time. The 55%, the stage 3, would occur a little less than 10%, similar for 65, and the 75% you'd only be in that for about 5% of the time. You'd be at full pumping, the 100%. In other words, you wouldn't be in the critical period only 40 or 45% of the time.
Can you repeat that last part?
The last part says that you would only be at full ability to pump above the threshold only 40 to 45% of the time, depending on which time period. This is something we talked about last night. The blue line represents the full record, 40 to 22. The red line represents the new gauge, 15 to 22. And you can see they're a little bit different, but not a whole lot. And for our purposes here, they basically show the range, but they're functionally giving you the same kind of information. So when you take all that together, basically in zone 1 on average, there'd be a 29% reduction in pumping overall, and you'd be in one of these stages between 55 and 60% of the time. Zone 2 had less drastic cuts, but the pattern is the same. 55 to 60% of the time you'd be in critical period management. Overall reduction would be about 23%. Now remember, zone 1, there was good correlation between water levels and the spring flow. Zone 2, it was a decent correlation. In zone 3, there was no correlation. It had nothing to do with the spring flow. Yet, under this plan, you'd wind up overall with a 17% reduction in pumping because these spring flows would trigger. Now, the other caveat on this is I didn't include any assumed, once you turn the pumping down, I didn't assume the spring flow would recover it all. It'd be minor, but it would be there. And I didn't include any non-reductions associated with the crop protection provisions. For our purposes, it was just a simple analysis to get an idea of how often this would be implemented. So knowing that, I know Charlie's asked me several times, how would you go about selecting thresholds? Well, using that same concept, that same statistical analysis, you really need to start with what is your policy objective? 3 examples. Do you want to have an overall reduction in pumping? Do you want to manage for drought periods? Or do you want to manage for critical drought periods, as the document was labeled? Now, in the memo in June, I went through this analysis in anticipation of how I would run these through the model. And I looked at the 10th percentile, the 33rd percentile, and the 50th percentile as thresholds in order to have some understanding of the recovery of the spring flow, how often it would be implemented, and what the pumping reductions would be overall. So if you do that, these are the kinds of flows that we're talking about. In the 10th percentile, you can see they're all in the mid to low single digits in CFS. The 33rd percentile, they're in the 10-ish range, and the 50th percentile, they're in the 14, 15 range. So if you were to go a real simplified threshold concept, the 4 CFS is roughly associated with the 10th percentile. That's something you might call a critical drought period because that's only happening 10% of the time. That's what you're trying to avoid or manage against. If you wanted to expand that a little bit and call it a drought period management, then you're looking at something like the 33rd percentile. That's about 9 CFS. If you're interested in just a flat out pumping reduction concept, that would be something associated with the median, 50th percentile. That'd be on the order of 15 CFS. So from a simplified standpoint, the most important thing, and this is one of the reasons that it was best for me not to be here, because this committee is the one that's the appropriate place to define the policy objective. Once you define the policy objective, then some of the numbers are fairly easy to work out. But without that, it's sort of, wandering around in the desert until you have some concept of what you're trying to achieve. If you want to do questions now on that, or you want me to just jump into the dye study.
Maybe anybody has a question.
I would like to say, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The science or the policy? I think this policy should be based on the science, and that's just my opinion.
From my standpoint, it's difficult for me to, I've given you essentially 3 pretty wide-ranging options with the hope that the committee would basically hone in on what is the policy objective. They go hand in hand, you're right, but at some point, a decision has to be made in terms of what the policy objective would be, because then you're sort of in this, once you establish, say it's a drought period, well then you can get in, well, is the 33rd percentile appropriate? It should be the 25th, or the 30th, or the 29th. Those kinds of things can be worked out once you establish what that is. What doesn't work is to have something called critical management period happen 70% of the time. There's a big disconnect in that, in what was submitted.
It seems like politics and science are always
They're
at
only
odds.
right. But what we can say is what was submitted was like this.
Yeah.
You call it critical period, but it's happening 70% of the time. That doesn't make any sense. And what I'm trying to do here is say, if you're going to call it critical, you're talking about something like 10%. If you're talking drought, you're talking about something like a third of the time. If you want to go straight pumping reduction, then maybe half the time is the appropriate label for that.
I don't want to speak for who wrote the plan, but I think its objective was pumping reduction, so it was mislabeled.
Clearly.
But yes.
Clearly.
And I would I would want to support a plan whose objective is that. So thank you for putting these numbers together
Yeah.
and helping us understand.
No, I appreciate it. I like what you're doing.
Why would you reduce, like the wells down southeast or southwest of here, if they have no effect?
I didn't put the plan together.
Oh, okay, I'm just saying.
No.
I'm just saying,
That's
we
kind of-
know it's directly
That's kind of one of the
affects the
points.
springs is the Edwards,
Yeah,
not
what-
Edwards Trinity, not those
That's-
down
Yeah.
there. Yeah. Why would
We
you?
could, we could
restrict-
discuss that, but clearly, the wells in zone 3, based on the data that we have nothing to do with the spring, yet this plan
So why would you?
would have a
reduce that?
17% reduction. That's kind of what I'm pointing out, is this has no
That
connection
water is
to,
past the springs and gone.
this has no connection to spring flow protection at all.
Isn't it like 80% of the water goes out in this county underground? Or more?
Ooh, I don't remember the 80%, it's a lot.
So,
Go ahead.
Something that was mentioned in the meeting last night, we talked about wells in the Austin Chalk and there being a phenomenon where you could have water being drawn out and then other water being introduced in below that well, water from the Edwards aquifer. So there is connection between the two aquifers.
Well, hypothetically, there's a connection.
And
What we were
anecdotally.
What we were talking about was, could it be that way? And my answer was yes. That's one of the reasons we're trying to establish that monitoring network down there, in order to get data to understand that. When we do the correlation between water levels and spring flow, we don't see any correlation. Now, if you pumped it hard enough, then you might change the hydraulics of the system, and it could draw water in. But under current conditions, that doesn't seem to be the case.
what
So
the-
with more pumping, there could be more of a draw in the springs, wells in zone 3.
Where the wells are located, well, that's the other problem that we have, if you remember. There's a gap in our monitor. Historically, there's been a gap, and that's one of the reasons, 18 months ago, some of those wells we started instrumenting more wells down there to try and fill in that gap. But that data isn't mature enough to be able to draw those conclusions.
But what
today.
Mr. Bain is saying, that there's no connection, that is not true.
So what he's saying is, we don't know.
Right, but I just
But
wanted to confirm
based on the
that,
data
because
that we
those are
have
two
now,
different-
there is no connection.
We
But
don't,
if you pump it hard enough, it may be, but that's not
Or
happening.
I'm hearing based
What
on the data we have now, there's a potential connection.
well, there's a potential connection everywhere. But when you're doing this kind of work, you're always assuming that it could be. That's why I did the water level correlations. And the water level correlations suggest, at least at the wells we have data for, there's no connection there. But most of those areas haven't been pumped very hard. So we just don't, at this point, it's
Save for the last few years.
speculative. Well, no, in zone 3, there hasn't been any pumping down there. Zone 3 is way outside of it. We're talking about down the southern
Way
part of
south
the
of
county,
90.
south of the county, southern part of the county. Yet, this plan had something connecting it to the springs, which is not there. I think we're talking about two different areas.
Well, there's a
There's
big
an area,
irrigation area in Austin, on the Austin Chalk.
yes.
So that is in zone 2?
Part of it is in zone 3,
So there is pumping in zone 3.
not recently.
There's a farm
If you
there
go-
now.
If you go back and look at the satellite work, the last couple of years, there hasn't really been much in the way of pumping. At least that's what the
I've
information.
driven down the road and seen it.
Okay, well, something else is going on.
I do
Or we're
believe that's the
talking about two
case.
different areas.
It's the only direct influence on the springs, you know the exact wells. We know for sure the Edwards, that's in front of the springs to the north and northeast, is directly tied to the springs, but we don't know for sure on any of the rest. Is that correct?
Okay,
We have no
we
scientific.
went through this last night. The concept of Edwards and Edwards Trinity is false. It's all Edwards and Trinity. The geology is the same. It's all Edwards, it's all Trinity underlying it. The concept of Edwards Aquifer and Edwards Trinity Aquifer is a construct of the way the Water Development Board drew maps years ago.
Yeah, it's up there.
I know, those are wrong. They've designated those as aquifers. But when you go from one side of that line to the other in the Edwards Trinity Aquifer, those are connected. There's a long history of why these maps were drawn the way they were. But from a hydrogeologic perspective, they're not telling the full story of how the Edwards Trinity as defined in these maps is connected.
I don't think we can find any correlation to that. when we're pumping, so far, what we're affecting is the Hooley well, not the springs.
Are the
We've been doing
Kinney
it
well and the
this way.
springs not highly correlated?
The Dooley well in the spring is well correlated.
And how are you determining that?
Science,
Water levels, that's correlating the water levels in the Dooley well and the spring well. That's what we did 2 years ago.
And then
for the management.
so who came up with the zones, zone 1, 2, and 3?
Me.
Okay, so zone 2, which is down there, southwest that he was talking about. How are you tying that to these, to this?
Let's go through the dye study, because the dye study has some insight into that.
Yeah, the southwest.
Okay, so the dye study was done. Are there any other questions about the thresholds?
Can we go back to it after this?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the dye study was published in 2015. The actual work was done between 2007 and 2012. So this was a chart I used last night that showed plotted up the precipitation, the pumping, and the spring flow, and it shows the dye study period. It started in one of the wettest years on record, and then you can see the spring flow in the green line crashed. It went from very high to very low during that time period. Pumping was low in 2007 because of the heavy rains, and then kind of stabilized around 3,000 acre feet. Now, the study had a couple of maps, the old LBG Guyton map, contour map of the county, and if you draw flow lines based on these contour lines, that sort of shows where it's going. And I gotta emphasize that the data they had available for this is nothing compared to the data we have now. They also include Ron Green's map that showed both Kinney and Indian Valley counties, and those are the kind of flow directions that you see. So the dye trace study consisted of putting dye in these 6 features: caves, wells, whatnot. This is the Alamo Cave trace after 1,900 days. And you can see that when they put the dye in the Alamo Village cave, it basically followed subparallel to the drainage. This is important because we know that the groundwater flow preferentially follows streams. It's how the karstic development created preferential flow paths that are basically aligned with the streams. Then they put dye in the Dooley well, and again, it follows the creek to the southwest. So in these 2 cases, water just stayed basically within the watershed and went down the path of the creek. The Borshing well, in 7 days, it hit the spring. Now, when you get up further to the northeast, the Whitney Cave, that dye was picked up after 1,000 days, was picked up all over the place. Not only the spring, but in lots of places to the south and to the east and to the southeast. So this tells, now it didn't follow the path, it crossed watershed boundaries because hydraulic gradients were such that it would just spread out and go whichever way the gradients would take it. So this says that it may follow the path preferentially, but it can cross boundaries, cross watershed boundaries. Same thing in the Pratt Sink. Same thing in the Grass Valley well. So it wanted to follow down with the Elm Creek, but it also wound up in the spring. So when they plot up all the dye traces, this was their final map. So it basically showed a preference for, in the northwest, that it would stay in the creek, or stay in the preferential flow path, but the ones to the east kind of went wherever it needed to go based on hydraulic gradients. And what I did is take this plot and then plot it on zones 1, 2, and 3. So you can see everything is basically staying within zone 1 as I defined it a couple of years ago.
So how are you getting that top big black line arrow going all the way west. On the-
That black arrow is their black arrow.
I know, okay, but how are they, whenever they put in the different dyes, nothing like cross, I'm just asking, like,
They
'cause it
did it.
just goes way over.
Yeah.
But yet whenever they break down the dye test, nothing
Well,
kind of
if you go
crosses the
back-
path right there.
Now, if you go back to the Whitney Cave,
Yes, but look, it's kind of, it didn't go all the way to
It
the
didn't go
Kinney,
towards
was what I'm
the
no,
saying.
it went to Alamo, it went to Alamo Cave.
Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't go to the spring.
It didn't
Well,
go-
so the idea was that if it gets to Alamo Cave, then it makes sense that it would continue on to the southwest after 1,000 days.
Assumption.
Well, they did the report.
I know, I'm just asking, because.
I'm just-
I mean,
Basically, well, let me get to what I have as takeaways from this. Alamo Cave and Dooley Well support our conceptual model of preferential flow paths along drainages because of the karst. That's the foundation of the model I'm putting together. But the others, the Whitney Cave, Pratt Sink, Grass Valley, demonstrate that flow can cross watershed boundaries. That's important because we know that the hydraulic or pressure gradient will control groundwater movement. So it's important to remember the dye trace, the dye will just follow along with the groundwater.
Yeah.
It follows transport.
but there's also shallow water and deep water. There's different layers there too.
But what it doesn't do is, you can't use dyes to figure out capture. When a well is pumped, three things happen. Water level is lowered, which reduces storage. It will induce inflow from outside areas, and it will capture natural outflow, in this case, spring flow. So your concept is that if the dye trace doesn't show up in the spring, it's not capturing natural outflow. But what it doesn't tell you is what induced inflow there is. So you take the Bennett and Sayer cartoon of the spring, and I apologize for my artistic inability, but if you put a well off to the side that's tapped into the same formation that feeds the spring, and the water level is the same as the head above the spring, there's no flow between. This is like we would call the natural condition. So you would see no drawdown at the well. You would see the full spring flow because the water level is well above the vent of the spring, but you wouldn't see any dye movement there. If you start pumping this well, you're going to lower the head. There'll still be some spring flow, not full spring flow, but some, because you're capturing water that would have gone to the spring, but you're drawing it in because of the pumping. And you still wouldn't see any dye in the spring because the water's going from the spring or from the area of the spring to the well. And then if you get into a high pumping or persistent drought scenario, you actually lower the head below the top of the spring's dry. You still get a lot of drawdown, you're still getting capture, you still are not gonna get any dye that winds up in the spring if you stick anything up.
Yeah, but this
into the
water's
well.
moving here. This water doesn't stay still.
That's exactly
It's
the
like an
point.
underground river.
Well,
So
it's
when
not-
you're saying that it's not moving, it's moving all the time down there.
It's moving, but in this
So this
one,
drawing concept doesn't always necessarily go hand in hand.
no, just think 3 dimensions. This water is flowing towards you in the natural condition. It's coming down from the north, Pinto Valley's going to the south. You know, it's moving this way out of the picture. And so under the natural condition, you're not gonna see any movement between the two because all the flow is coming out. Now, once you start pumping, now instead of coming this way, some of it's gonna go to that well. So think in terms of 3 dimensions on this. And like I said, Mike, this is my poor attempt at art. I'm not.
So that if it's moving south, and whenever they put the dye down the Dooley well, how come it didn't come out of this?
Because
it's moving.
Because under the natural condition,
You know, there was no pumping on the Dooley well, there was no pumping.
well, there's not pumping at the Dooley well, but there's plenty of pumping nearby.
Well, I know, but what I'm saying is it should, if it's moving like you say, it should show up eventually.
No, because now what you're doing
I
is.
mean, there's
in this
gotta be a
whole-
vein somewhere.
No, in this whole area, you've lowered the head in the Pinto Valley
But you just said it rained a lot, and the head was high.
at the beginning of it, and it was dropping through the time. And the pumping continued to drop.
But in the Borsig well, you have it showing up in, what'd you say?
7 days.
7 days.
That's a different system, because again, that's coming straight from the north down Los Moras Creek.
Hey, but how,
Well, that's what I'm trying to explain.
That's a true correlation.
yeah, I mean, that's direct right there. I just-
Here's the Borsche well, and so if you pump here, you're actually capturing water that would have gone to the spring. Here, what you're doing is you're inducing flow from this area back into the Pinto Valley.
Because did it on Davis and McDaniels, didn't it take you like 2,000 days to move a mile? Well, they were pumping, they were drawing that dial. So.
They were drawing it.
They should have pulled it into their well and it took 2,000 days?
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
but what you're doing, but that's transport. When you're dropping the head due to pumping, that's a pressure response, and that pressure response happens very quickly. And that's what's drawing water in from the Los Moras Creek area back towards Pinto Valley.
But the Edwards, or the spring flow here, you can be 20 miles away and in 5 days it'll be out the springs. Is that correct?
The pressure
The
response,
most,
the pressure
direct
response
flow
happens.
is Edwards, was defined as Edwards.
They're all Edwards.
Well,
This is all in the Edwards
You
formation.
sure there's not a fault line between here and there?
Well, the fact that the water levels correlate between the
And fault
Dooley well,
lines change direction of water.
faults can be conduits or barriers. We talked
Can
about
be
this.
barriers.
We talked about this last night. The fault system, it's been mapped there's three maps of the Geologic Atlas of Texas. The USGS did a study in 2010, and those faults sort of line up. The URS study, the faults are in a whole different direction. We're still trying to work out why those are different. Why they don't honor, why they're not consistent with the data or with the previously published studies. They're just very different. So I look at that, and I look at the Ditrace study, and I say, you can't get dye into Los Moras Spring from the Pinto Valley because the head in the Pinto Valley is probably lower. So you can't have water flow uphill. The pressure response is actually drawn water in from the west, or from the east, back towards Pinto Valley, and that's why the water levels correlate well with the spring flow. It's not as connected as the Borsche well, clearly.
well then how come they're flowing and this one's dry? Like, those are flowing still over there.
Where?
Huh? At the old McDaniels and Davis, they
Yeah.
are. But this one's not flowing anymore.
Well, what's the relative elevation?
Well, that's what I'm saying, this is higher. Pinto Valley's higher than down there at the Springs. I mean, so how is that going together then?
Well, that's what we're doing this.
What has the most correlation to the spring is the wells closest to it.
Clearly.
No doubt about it.
Clearly.
No doubt about it.
Clearly.
And we know that for a fact.
But if they have head
But
and
we
this
do
one's
not
done,
know facts on
All I'm trying to
your
do.
Edwards to the east. or
All I'm trying to do is
west.
explain that the dye study, the fact that Dooley or Alamo Cave didn't wind up in the spring does not mean that they're not connected.
Wouldn't it make sense to try to pump water from further away from the springs and see what happens? And not be pumping right on top of the springs. That's exactly what the Edwards did. On spring flow, they stopped farmers from pumping right next to the springs and cities from pumping right next to the springs because they knew it affected the spring flow the most.
Haven't you just
And they backed
explained
off.
though what would happen if you pumped, say, 8 miles from the springs in Pinto Valley? There would still be a lowering of the head pressure?
Well, what I'm trying to do here, I'm not trying to be definitive about anything. What I'm trying to say, and if I'm not saying it clearly enough, I apologize. The fact that the Alamo Cave and Dooley dye did not show up in the spring does not prove anything relative to the connection. What I'm also saying is that we have good correlation between the water levels in the Dooley well and the spring. So at this point, one of the big fallacies is that science can prove something. It can't. All we can do is prove something is wrong. We're constantly getting more data. We're constantly getting more information. Like you said, if you were to go out and develop a big pump test to evaluate this like they did at the EAA, you'd get more information.
Right.
Clearly, a well that's close to the spring tapped into the same formation is gonna have a whole lot more effect than a well 8 miles.
So with that being said, if the city, we're in drought, 70%, whatever, but they kick that well on and they trigger a stage with it, yet it's them, it's not the farmer, because they're pumping right there. They have a direct correlation that it's modeled. So then how are you gonna try to put us at a 20% or 10% reduction
I'm not-
whenever they're, I know, I'm not, let's see if you can answer the
Well,
question.
you
But
are
how do
timing
you
it
do
in a
that
way you
whenever they're
kinda are.
dictating the deal? You know what I mean? They're moving the needle
You're
more than we are.
You're
apparently.
asking the right question.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. How do you,
I don't think anyone's
How do you
negating that we need to
justify
take
that?
all wells into consideration, including the ones close to the springs. But I'm also hearing from what you're saying, Dr. Hutchison, that even if they're a greater distance from the springs, but they're pumping with more intensity or with more concentration of many wells, then it will have an impact on the springs. Or it could.
It's everything, we start with the idea that it is possible. Because the correlation between the water levels in the spring, that suggests there could be a connection. What all I'm trying to do with this dye study is disabuse anybody of the notion that just because Alamo and Dooley did not show up in the spring, that doesn't prove anything. That means very little, because these showed that water could cross watershed boundaries,
yeah, but they're not deep water all the time. Some are shallow, some are deep.
clearly.
Yes.
That's one of the other limitations of this thing is the third dimension, the depth dimension.
Yeah.
So my take on folks who are reading directly from this stupid report like it meant something. And yes, I read this, I was involved at the latter stages of this thing, I understood what it meant. It told me that preferential flow paths are important. It told me that water could cross watershed boundaries. It also played into the idea when I was developing the model last year, when I put in the URS faults, something wasn't right. And something about that added, among other things, the problem that I was having in calibrating the model.
What was the stupid thing you were referring to?
Pardon?
You referred to a stupid thing, what was that?
This report,
The dye test.
the dye test,
Okay.
basically has been abused because folks think that it proves something. It doesn't prove anything. It's a piece of information that goes into all the stuff that we're doing.
Well, it does prove which way it flows.
It proves, to me, what it tells me is that there are preferential flow paths, that's demonstrated in Alamo and Dooley, and it shows that water can cross watershed boundaries based on hydraulic gradient differences. We can see this one, it's all over the place.
But see, that goes back to her point with the Austin chalk. So the Austin chalk wells are like 80 foot, 82, 85. I have some. But whenever they stop drilling is whenever they hit the Del Rio clay.
Right.
Because that water sits on there. So her point of moving the Edwards and all that, that's not
Well,
true.
that's-
Because you stop, because it's a few hundred feet of Del Rio clay. So that water's sitting there in that gravel.
It's sitting.
And that's, so it's not affecting the Edwards, it's not tied to, it's separate.
As of
I don't think you're
as
hearing
of-
what he's saying.
As of today, you are correct.
Yes.
The gradients, the vertical.
And that's why they cement wells and they seal it off.
If the vertical gradients shift, you can induce vertical flow upward from the Edwards. Or if you pump the Edwards, you can induce vertical flow downward. That's not happening today. This is what we have at Fort Stockton. We've got Edwards wells on top of Russell, and you pump the Edwards hard enough, that crappy Russell water leaks upward, and it's degrading the water quality. So it can happen. I'm not saying it's happening here.
I mean, where has it happened here? Because, I mean, there's a few hundred feet of clay above it. I mean, I know that
It happens in your valley, Kelly.
very rare.
Well, no,
It's
but
very minimal.
the issue is not hundreds of feet of clay, the issue is how much head differential
And that
there
may
is.
be because they didn't cement a well.
No, the issue is how much head difference is there between the two formations. That'll drive it across 100 feet of clay. I've seen that happen.
How
And that's
many-
related to how much
So-
is being pumped out of the
And that-
area.
How
That's what I'm
many,
saying is that people get a little worked up about the amount of pumping here. The amount of pumping here is very small
Yes, I
compared
agree.
to a lot of areas. And so what we're talking about is a hypothetical situation where if there was a lot of pumping, you could induce this kind of change. We have no evidence that it's happening today. You haven't seen Austin chalk wells. One way you would find out real quick is that Austin chalk wells right now are pretty good water quality, right?
Yeah, they've always been.
Okay, if they start degrading over time, why would you think that would happen? Or what would you attribute that to?
They haven't.
No, if you
They
started
did.
seeing a rise in salinity, the first thing I would look for is water squirting up from the Edwards.
Yeah, but I mean, there hasn't been.
Exactly, because the
Yeah.
pumping hasn't been very high.
Well, I mean, we pump them.
We can pump them, but
And
not
they, and they
like,
drop. I mean, they do this all the time, whether it rains or
Right.
it doesn't. They drop about 25% after they hit hard pumping, and then they stay flat.
I don't
They
think,
just hold
I don't think you have an appreciation
it.
for,
So you're pulling it down.
I don't think you have an appreciation for other areas where this happens, how much pumping there is.
I know, we're not
In
doing
relation
that.
to
I
here,
agree.
it's hardly
But
anything.
to answer her
It
question.
is double our annual average, though. It was in 2022 in the years following, I'm assuming. And it was mentioned last night that it's looking like 11,000.
That's not from the Austin chalk.
No, that's not.
No, from the county total, from the county total.
So trying to apply a county
Still very
total to
minute.
what we're talking about here in the Austin chalk is not working.
I just wanted there to not be a generalization made that it's not a lot of pumping
I
in the
think
county.
the
That's how I
majority of the major pumping is to the northwest and
Yes.
southwest. That has the least effect on these springs. That's what I think. And I think the ones that have the most effect are the ones to the east. And I think it's very, very minimal what they're pumping. I don't think you could pump 1,000 acre feet there, probably. I'm just guessing. How many is in front of the springs that actually in the old Edwards, and now you say it's all the same, but anyway, I think the old timers know more than we do. But anyway, that's just me.
I thought that
There was a reason why they did that.
I must
They
be
saw something.
misinterpreting it.
Oh, hold
Okay.
on. Are you done?
Anyway, I'm
Yeah,
just,
thank you.
Oh, your back's to
But
everybody.
I think what I'm hearing though is that in Pinto Valley, there's a high concentration of mini wells pumping. And in that case, that could affect the head pressure, that could affect the springs. And that seems to be a contradiction to what Mr. Bain is saying and that you're affirming from him. So I'm not understanding why his statement is being affirmed
Wait.
that wells-
We're all over the place. We're Austin chalk, we're Pinto Valley. Let's be clear here.
Okay, can I be clear? What I heard Mr. Bain say was that the only pumping that's gonna affect the springs is pumping extremely close to the springs, which would rule out Pinto Valley. I think he's assuming that's too far to have an impact on the
I'm
springs.
saying that's what we have direct correlation to right now.
Is it pumping by the spring?
That we know for sure. That's concrete.
Okay, so we agree on
We're
that.
not concrete on everything else. Can you
In-
disagree or
in-
agree with that?
In the order of importance,
Yes.
the city wells and
And
the Fort Clark wells have the most effect on the spring.
would it help?
Everything
to-
else,
To try to pull further away
Well,
and
wait,
bring
wait,
some water.
wait,
I'm
wait,
just
wait,
saying,
wait.
would that help us more for spring flow than doing this other restriction?
well,
Is it-
all right, let's talk about that. The amount of pumping from the city wells and the Fort Clark wells
It's minimal.
is maybe 1,100 acre feet. Relatively minor. Compounding that, this district has no authority to regulate pumping from the city,
Right, okay.
okay? I mean, these are,
Yeah.
this is the real world.
I mean, it's, they have a right to that.
Now, we see good correlation in zone 1 between water levels and the spring. We see reasonably good correlation in zone 2. We see no correlation in zone 3. That's the state of where we are. Jumping to conclusions that this proves or disproves something is premature.
Right, and I don't wanna do something that hurts people, and it could be anyone in this county, unduly, you know. You can call it duly well, but unduly to hurt somebody, okay? I mean, we gotta have correlation, direct correlation. We've gotta have, what's the best scenario for this
Well,
county?
here's-
And we know the best thing is to back these wells off, if we can, if it's possible, further away from the springs, and let's see what happens. It may make it 1,100 gallons, doesn't sound much, but if 1,100 acre feet, I don't know, 1,100 acre feet would flow out of those springs, maybe we'd bring it back. Because I know cone impressions, I've done this, and everybody monitors that stuff. And when you do a water availability study, you drill a well, and then you go another one, you know, a quarter mile away, and you see how much you're pumping for 24 or 48 hours, how much effect it has.
Nora,
and
does the
how
city of
it
Brackett
regains
have
back.
money to move the
Let me
well?
back
Well, I'm
let me
just
back
saying
up,
that
let me
it's a
back up.
possibility, if we really want to spend money wisely, you know what I'm saying?
Let me back you up just a half a step. You keep using the term correlation. That may be a little bit misplaced.
Okay.
Correlation is different than causation. And what you're really talking about is causation. And really what I usually do is, when I have to do impact analysis, I look at a 3-step test. Is it measurable? Is it attributable? And is it significant? If it's not measurable, why are we talking about it? If it's not attributable to, in this case, is the spring and Pinto Valley connected? You have to attribute spring flow reduction to Pinto or Grass Valley or anywhere else. And then finally, is it significant? Does it mean you have to do something? I'm gonna steal some of Jim's thunder, but you can, right now we can see little blips in the spring monitor. We put a probe in the spring vent, and you can sort of track pumping in the city wells and changes in the spring vent. Okay, that's measurable, that's attributable. Is it significant? Probably not. So I think what we're dealing with, I would encourage you to not use the word correlation. I would encourage you to use a concept related to that 3-step test. In order to, as we go through this, that's sort of the way we're parsing it out. Now, ultimately, the board is the one that makes the decision on significance. I help them with measurable and attributable. And then they have to decide, is that something that's significant enough that you have to do something?
Okay.
Okay, so then go back to your spring flow and all that. So then on October 26th or 27th, an Oasis River came down, flooded. All right? Camp flood. Like 7 days later, this thing started flowing.
Right.
Did it rain in Brackettville?
Right.
Not enough to create spring flow. Okay. And that thing flowed till what? Maybe 3 weeks ago?
About a month ago, yeah.
Month ago or something, with no rain. Only place it rained was there. I never quit pumping down there. I never quit pumping up here because I had weak coastal all the way into December.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I had fall-
it flowed barely.
and I had
It
fall.
wasn't a good flow.
But what I'm saying is it wasn't flowing, and just because it rained there, it didn't rain in town,
Right.
it didn't rain there.
Right.
My wells never flowed. My wells stayed the same. So how can it start flowing whenever I don't quit, whenever I'm 10 miles south, but yet, you
Because
know
it
what I mean?
rained.
It's not
Well,
going.
the rainfall.
I understand that, but
The
if
rainfall in
we're saying that
Brackett-
I'm pumping it down, I would have drone it down very fast. Not 5 months later, 4 months.
Well, again, this goes back to,
That's what I'm
just
saying.
from a pure water budget standpoint, you have to have an appreciation for how much it recharges, how much the spring flows, how much the pumping is, and how much just natural outflow there is. And I went through all that in September, a little bit of it.
But that's what I'm saying, just
So-
raining in the northeast part of the county made that thing flow for 4 months, even though, right here, South Town, that pivot kept running on his week, right, watered all winter up there.
That's what I'm trying to explain.
Yeah.
Is that, I know Gage doesn't like this, but the pumping is very low on a historic basis in comparison to the other components of the water budget. Average recharge in the county exceeds 100,000 acre feet. Spring flow, long-term average, what was the number? Spring flow, this is in CFS. Spring flow was about 18,000 acre feet. A fairly minor component of the recharge. Pumping, that everyone's all upset about, has peaked out at about 11,000. Very small. So what happened over a 2 or 3 week period when you were pumping over the winter?
No, we pump still till today, we never
Yeah.
stop.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that
Different crops.
That's a small part of the 11,000 from last year. So in a large respect, and this is what I keep saying, the rainfall, not just here in town, but
Yeah, it's up there.
up north.
It didn't rain here.
Right. The rainfall up north is what drives the spring.
Yeah.
What we're talking about with pumping is a fairly minor component of it, and we haven't had a good rain in over 5 years.
Correct.
As you can see in here, even during the worst droughts, like in 11 and 12, there was always at least a year that there was a big rain that caused, and you can see that in the spring flow, it pops back up, and then rain. Everything's based on the rains, fills everything up,
Yeah, I agree.
and the spring flows out.
Yes,
Then
I
over
agree.
time, it drains, then it rains again, back and forth. What we've had here for the last 5 years, it's just stayed low.
Yeah.
We had 22, in July of 22, we got 7 inches of rain. Spring flowed for about, 4, 5, 6 months. Then it went back to near dry.
Yeah.
That wasn't enough to keep it sustained flow. And when you look at the record, that 7 inches of rain, still during the drought. That wasn't enough to really push the system
Yeah.
to fill it back up. We just
Well,
haven't seen
well,
any
yeah,
good filling for over
Yeah,
5
because
years.
2 weeks later, the wells.
So
are
all the
turned
little
back on.
pumping that's going on is not near as important as getting that big rain.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Could I bring it back to the purpose we're all here? It's a rules committee meeting. We're here to establish rules that allow us to conserve pumping when we don't get that rain that we need to recharge the aquifer. And you have said you're here to empower the district board with the science needed to make policy decisions. Many people on this committee, our management objective is to maintain minimum spring flow even in drought periods. So what can you tell us to allow us to create policy that can help us succeed on that objective?
That's the simple version. If you're interested in a pumping reduction plan, then you would want to have things kicked off at about 15 CFS. If you only want to protect against drought periods, about 9. If you only wanted to get the worst 10% of the critical drought, you trigger it at about 4.
And
And David and I had this discussion last night. I'm not the one making the decision. My role is to provide information that helps the people who do make the decisions, what the implications of that are.
And so if
This
they
is,
make
wait,
the
wait, let me finish.
decision.
This is important because picking one of those 3, just as a hypothetical, thank you. Picking one of those 3, any one of them has implications that are way beyond my role, way beyond my pay grade, if you will. The difference between triggering something 10% of the time versus 50% of the time is they're different universes. That's the board's decision. And so what I'm saying is that to the extent y'all are interested in flat out reducing pumping, this kind of number is what would be appropriate, not 28 CFS.
And this number, if it kicked in at 15 CFS, that could result in increased spring flow.
Any one of them would, potentially.
Okay, that seems to contradict the conversation earlier before we went back to this, where we were talking about rainfall, and it's just maybe the way I'm interpreting it, what you're saying, because if we do restrict pumping, that will have an impact on the springs, a beneficial impact for when we want to see it.
Again, it goes back to how significant.
Yeah, I thought
If
you
you, if you,
said
if
that
you
it was
triggered
very
it, if
minor
you,
effect.
if you
pumping.
triggered it at 4 CFS, things have already drained down pretty far. So if you shut off 20% of the pumping instead of 4 CFS, it's on the way down. And if you did nothing, maybe it'd go to 3. And maybe with all the pumping reductions, it would be somewhere between 3 and 4, at least for the first month. We don't know. that's a decision the board would have to make to say, is that something that we would want to do?
What if you did 15?
Again,
All right,
if it's
all right,
15,
What kind of reductions would be necessary to achieve
let me
these
interrupt
kind
here.
of things?
These are board things. These will be,
No, they're not.
No, yes, they are. That's not the purpose of the Rules Committee.
I'm asking him to expound on the numbers he has here, the 15 CFS,
But
how it relates to the hydrology.
He's given us, parameters, the Rules Committee will come up with recommendations, probably more than one,
I
to
don't
the
feel
board.
comfortable coming up with recommendations until I know more of the science, and you were about to give an
But-
answer, I would like to hear it.
I think he's given the answer several times.
I'm sorry, could you?
What is
the
answer,
please-
Charlie?
Sir?
What's the answer?
The answer is that he's given different levels, and the board comes up with a policy.
But what would we have to do to obtain these type of parameters here? Pumping reduction, what do we gotta drop it down to? What would we have to
He
do?
gave-
If we
he gave
institute
us-
that, what would that
He
do?
gave us numbers last night.
that's the thing, is here, we're seeing what the thresholds were. The companion is then what's the action? Okay, so we saw 25, 35, 45% kind of numbers in your document. If you started with 10, if you just did, 30 or something, I don't know. Those are things those become more policy decisions because it affects the permit holders.
Well, we're supposed to be developing rules. And it
Rule
seems like that
suggestions.
information is important.
Suggestions.
Yes, it's a very weak committee. We're suggesting things, and we have no power to do
Right.
anything, not a slightest bit of anything. Just
And
talk.
one of the thi- and one
We're
of
just
the-
talking a lot. That's
Well,
what
one
we're
of the
doing
things
is
Charlie
chatting.
said, I heard Charlie say something about if you focused on the concepts, then a lot of the number stuff could get worked out. And so one of the things I have not heard is critical drought, pumping reduction. What we got was something labeled critical period management that was clearly just flat out pumping reduction. So I think if as a committee, if you're talking about, do you want to do something only at the driest periods versus do you want to do something that flat out just reduces pumping 20, 30, or 40%?
I mean, clearly, if we wait to 4, we're already screwed. Like, at 4, it's almost done. At 4.
Well, but the data tells us that at 15, it's on the way down.
That's what I'm
And so the
saying.
question
So
then
start at
becomes, this
15
gets to
maybe?
Yes.
the question if you're already at 15 and it's on the way down, it's impossible to tell, but we know there's the potential that it goes from 15 to 12 to 8, and it just keeps going down, but if you start curtailing pumping, maybe it would stabilize at some point.
Maybe.
Maybe it wouldn't,
Maybe.
because again,
Because we don't
if it
know,
doesn't rain,
we don't know how much is flowing out underneath,
But
below
can
the
you
spring.
talk more
under
about
the
the
ground.
data that suggests you could see an uptick if you implemented the curtailments based on the
well,
pumping reduction scenario?
that's what I did in September. On a big scale, I said that if in 21 and 22, 21 and 22, if the pumping instead of been, if they had been 7 to 9,000, if it had only been 3 to 5,000 or something
4 to
like that,
5,000.
4 to 5,000, then you would have seen an increase of about 1 to 8 CFS based on looking at the data.
That is a scenario I feel very good about, and I want to create policy around. And I don't know who else feels that way, but I want to be clear about that.
So the question then comes down to, that sort of defines the percentage reduction. It's what is that, a 40% reduction?
All right, we're gonna move on.
So-
I do have one question. The zone 1, 2, and 3, you're doing this geologic study now, or that someone's helping you with or doing for you. Do you anticipate possibly changing those zones? And if
Oh,
so,
yeah.
when will that
I'm
data be
glad
available?
you asked that.
Is that a May, was that May thing?
Yeah, let me clarify that. I think there was some misstatements about this. These zones were created 2 years ago for the management plan. They're based solely on the correlations between water levels in the monitoring wells and the spring flow. I think someone talked about how it incorporated everything, and it did not. Let me tell you why it didn't. When you do this kind of work, it's best to start simple and then add complexity where it's needed. We had good data for the first time. We had good water level data that didn't exist when all these other maps were developed and all that. And we had good spring flow data after the new gauge was put in. So those were the best data to draw these correlations. That's what the basis of the map was. At the time we developed the map, there was no discussion about using this as, that all evolved later as far as the triggers and everything. At this point, I don't know if zone 1 and zone 2, because they're both reasonably well correlated, you would make much of a distinction between them if you were going to do something like this as a starting point. Zone 3, I wouldn't even bother with. I wouldn't even, at least you can eliminate that, having anything to do with the spring. So as time goes on, it would certainly be appropriate to revisit the zones in the context of what you all might wind up doing here. It's hard to do that in a vacuum, but if you start looking at something like this in more detail, that would be the time to go back and look at the zones in more detail. Plus, we realized if you look where the words Lost Moras Spring are, that boundary between zone 2 and between zone 2-3 boundary and zone 1-2 boundary, that area to the southwest of the spring, that's where we had very limited data. And when we first put this map together 2 years ago, Jim, we looked at this and said, here's some spots we need some monitoring wells, and Jim started collecting data out there about, 18 months ago? Yeah. So we're getting more data on that to help refine these boundaries. The plan was always to refine these as data came in and as the needs developed specific to an objective.
I would like to know how you came up with correlation with the Dewey well and the springs.
I'll pull it up.
I'm asking.
I mean, I got
Whip it out, bud.
Okay, you pull it up.
I got the plot. Let me see if I can find it.
Could I ask a question to Mr. Gaines about, given what Mr. Hutchison said about we need to determine what our policy objective is, could we vote as a committee on which one of those 3 scenarios we want to work toward? And then it would help Dr. Hutchison know what data to give us to write the plan?
As we explained at the beginning, there's no voting. All right?
Even amongst
Because-
us?
No, there's not, because if the different opinions, what we will do is if we cannot agree on a given concept or number, then we will submit different concepts or numbers to the board. So, I don't know, again, hypothetically, if you want 15 and somebody over here wants 4, we'll present both. There's no voting, it's not like, well, it's 9-8 in favor of, of 15 or 9 or something. We'll submit all of it to the board and the board will decide. Okay, so there's no, it isn't a popularity thing. I mean, if we submit 17 plans to the board, I'm fine with it.
It just sounded like what Dr. Hutchison was saying was that the objective needs to come before the plan. So if they're being forwarded to the board at the same time, it won't be a good plan because we haven't yet determined what the objective is.
The board will determine the objective. The rules committee will come up with different recommendations. Right? There can, and using his words, there can be a pumping reduction recommendation. There can be a critical drought recommendation, a combination of all 3. But
Right
there's
now,
not
we
a.
don't really have we don't have an effective management plan right now to conserve resources that's in place that requires action. So we're coming in with some ideas to give the board.
To give to the
something
board so
to
that they
choose
can,
from.
perhaps.
I understand the.
Perhaps enact.
different
What's our
plans
current
going
cutoff
forward.
date on
Let
these
me
meetings?
finish. Let me finish.
There's no cutoff.
That is basically our purpose, as I understand it. We submit more than one plan, okay? However we see it. We submit plans and then the board will make a decision whether they want to take action on any of them, all of them, or whatever. But I understand we have a responsibility to come up with some ideas for groundwater conservation. And I understand I agree with you on your.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Going forward.
I'd
different
like to
people say,
reiterate-
there are too many, one side on the board, too many of the other, something, that's why there's no voting, we're trying to get around that. I mean, everybody has a voice and to be presented to the board.
I'd like to reiterate what he said about pumping has a minor effect on sprinkler.
Well, again, let's move on. I mean,
Did he say
That's
that?
awfully simplified, I don't
Hey,
think
hey,
so.
hey, we're
He
not.
said it's minor pumping.
Minor pumping in relation to Fort Stockton when they
Hey.
pump the shit dry.
Hey,
Minor, it's called,
Hey,
you know,
enough,
seriously,
enough. This-
seriously,
I
minor.
mean, you know, really.
It's a bad
Both-
choice of
both
words.
them.
Minor,
Well, it-
minor.
It is minor.
It
Is
is.
it minor relative to
It's-
other places, maybe?
Dr. Bill said it was minor relative to recharge, okay? And it is minor compared to other districts. It doesn't mean that it's minor relative to our spring.
Right.
So those are different concepts.
Right.
Let's move on.
Okay, the answer,
Is there-
this is the correlation,
This is your deal.
yeah, this is your correlation with the city well. Good correlation. Here's Tularosa, reasonably good correlation. Dooley well, good correlation.
Okay, on the Dooley well, you never asked me whenever I turned my well on. You never asked me whenever I turned his well on in that concentrated area, according to gauge, to drop it down. Or not drop it down. You know, our pumping up there our pumping will move the Dooley well. We can drop it. We can move it.
We moved really.
That's
Sure.
why we want.
We can move it.
Sure,
Yes.
clearly.
And there's a lot of days that the spring doesn't move whenever that happens.
Well, you're, okay.
That's what I'm saying. You have to.
And the
Yeah,
guy
but
took
no,
years
we're
to
talk-
get
we're
from A to
talking
B,
about- We're
so.
talking about the difference
That could
between
be
what happens
droughts too, right?
in a few days and weeks. This is from October 2014 to June of 22, monthly data. So we're talking about over a longer period of time.
Yeah.
And we see that when the water level is high, the spring flow is high. When the water level is low, the spring flow is low. That's correlation.
But I mean, the Dooley well doesn't move hardly much.
Correlation to
Doesn't
drought,
move
too.
too much. Yeah.
And we're beating this
But
one
you
to
can
death.
correlate drought right with it.
Again, what causes the spring to go low? Drought.
Drought, right.
But they're but when you look at other wells, let's look at an example of,
It's all up to Mother Nature.
Then why do we have a
Jim, give me a-
groundwater district?
Right?
give me something to the side.
We're trying to do a godly thing that we can't do. God is in control. We don't believe it.
That's no correlation there.
Who is that?
I mean, man could set a forest on fire and burn the whole thing down. That has nothing to do with God. I mean, clearly things can be damaged and destroyed. And look at the planet.
Here it's going the other way. Water levels, they're in the same drought you are. Everybody is.
Where's that well at?
South, way south. And,
Way south. Well,
well, you're saying it's drought. Well, there's drought and there's water levels going down when the spring goes up. That tells me there's no connection between those two.
well, it's work.
So how are you
Is
putting
it
connection on southwest?
Is that what you're thinking?
Huh?
How are you putting connection southwest then on standard length?
That map? That's what I was saying. This is where we don't have a lot of data in here. That's where that boundary.
Yeah, but we're farther south than that. We're right at the railroad track. I mean, your blue line is right along the
So is fair.
I'd have to go back and pull the map up.
But yet I'm in zone 2. That's my point.
Like I said, this was done for a different purpose, not for this purpose. And to the extent this purpose moves forward, then it makes sense to revisit these lines in that context. This was a first attempt, based on the data we had at the time, for basically to just show how things were connected to Los Moras Springs, or at least provisionally connected.
You just said you didn't have
It's-
data down there.
But you can't
We're
say you're
getting
not
more.
connected
We're
to
getting
the
more.
spring if you say every time you pump, you're connected to the dually, so you can't have it both
No,
ways.
that's up there.
He's got places.
So you got
Yes.
two places.
I have more
Okay,
places, yes.
so if we could keep those straight, that'd be fine, but.
So, I have a question related to, if the board were, say, in an extreme drought situation, and for whatever reason the board did decide that they wanted to implement some kind of curtailment, I know you had referred to this, I think, as a baseline problem in the sense of like curtail for what or curtail based on what.
Yeah.
Could you maybe address that and like tell us maybe what kind of options the board might look at?
Right,
for
in
that?
September, I specifically talked about another option, which would be for the board to basically do it as a public education, voluntary conservation, cutback kind of thing. That's always an option, and a lot of districts that have, not every district has a drought management policy, but a lot of them start with voluntary reductions. Okay, so I'll answer that. Then the second part is we've got a situation here where a lot of people's permits are much higher than their historic pumping. Now, I know the plan had some calculation based on previous actual use versus the permit to try and get around that. That's a real problem of how to implement. So
And with
that is-
EAA style rules, like,
The EAA rules won't work here. The EAA is a poor example to try and apply here.
you can explain why that is? I'm just-
Well, for one, their objectives are well defined by a federal court. So,
I mean, this is gonna end up in court.
you can just-
Maybe not a
No,
federal
I think
court,
he's, I
but
think
it's
he's talking
gonna
about
turn to a lawsuit.
the 10%, 20%, 40% reduction. I think that's what you're talking
Yeah.
about, right?
Well, no, that's-
You're talking about the federal because they got endangered species in the
but that's
spring.
why,
That's not,
but that's why they're
he's
cutting.
talking about the numbers. though.
No, I
Yeah.
understand. That's why
Yeah.
they're cutting it back. But see, that's the reason to cut it back.
Yes.
So it's all tied together.
Yeah.
And the objective there is very different than anywhere else in the state, but everybody wants to apply the same kind of style to everywhere else in the state.
Dr. Hutchison, didn't we have any endangered species?
There aren't any now. I don't know what the
But that doesn't mean that it might not be revived someday.
Well, then the feds come in and take over.
Can
Okay,
we
good.
get back to Terry's question, because I think a part of it was, if that's not gonna work, how it was proposed in the most recent plan, what would work
Well,
best?
here's the problem. From a structural standpoint, you've got some permits that basically pump near their limit. You've got some that pump a tiny fraction of their limit. Then you have Fort Clark. They're always up against their limit, their permit limit. Yet, under this concept, you would cut Fort Clark, because you can't treat Fort Clark different than any other permit. You'd wind up cutting Fort Clark's supply by 10, 20, 30, 40%.
I think there was
as
a
part-
provision in the plan to not cut back municipal users.
If it's there, I missed it, and I apologize, because I read the crop protection.
It's been added.
There was the crop protection, but the version I got, I don't remember seeing anything about.
I'll give you the update.
Well, but again, I'm not gonna speak for Greg, but one of the things Greg pounds into me is that you cannot treat permits differently. And these permits are both all H&E permits. You cannot treat them differently within a class. You can treat operating permits differently, but you can't treat H&E. So if you apply these
H&E.
historic and existing use. So you may put it in the plan and it's wonderful, but I suspect that Greg would say, can't do that.
Under the current rules.
No, under state law.
State law.
So you may want to try and exempt Fort Clark in an academic world, but I think in the real world, Greg would tell you that's not going to work.
In the real world, this is gonna come down to state law, rule of capture. If you crunch down on these irrigators too much, they're gonna lose lawsuit. It's gonna come down to
No,
law.
rule of capture doesn't have anything to do with it. What it has to do with is
Historical
districts are authorized to manage and limit production, but you have to do it within the context of Chapter 36. And that's where Greg is.
So it has to be an equal haircut, everybody has to get the equal haircut.
He's the authority on that part of it.
Even though, for example, Fort Clark is serving, I don't know, 1,500, 1,800, 2,000 people, and the same amount of water is going to some crop with.
There was a lawsuit,
Well, no.
there was a lawsuit that tried that.
Yeah.
TCEQ tried to, during the drought of 12, it was 12. TCEQ tried to essentially exempt municipal use from cutbacks on the Brazos River. The Dow Chemical case. The Dow Chemical said, we're the senior right holder. And it was made clear that the type of use is irrelevant. State law does not recognize a preference for municipal use over any other use.
No, I mean, I get it, right? I mean, and honestly, if I had a bunch of land, a bunch of permits, I'd probably drain that thing down and move it to pavement. But, you know,
Nick, you said something.
Well, I was saying that you have to give everybody an equal haircut. You can't cut this permit and not cut this permit. You have to cut all of them simultaneously.
But based on what? Permit level or use?
Yeah, you have to treat H&Es the same. You could treat operating permits and export permits differently.
Right, but when you say the same,
In terms of,
as a percentage of the permit,
no,
percentage of use?
no, in terms of whatever cutbacks you come up with, if you have hypothetically a 20% cutback,
Whether
that
it's
would
use or
apply-
permit.
That would apply, in an H&E sense, that would apply 20% to Fort Clark mud and 20% to the irrigators. You can't say
But we don't
irrigators,
consult with them.
Yeah, they can't enforce Fort Clark, so,
you can't enforce Brackettville.
Yeah,
Fort Clark mud.
yeah, Fort Clark's jacked.
Fort Clark mud has an H&E permit.
We have the same kind of permit as they do, right?
You have a certain amount of control over
They'll have an
I
H&E
didn't know
permit.
that.
Yeah,
Well,
but our permit's not like so much way above our
Well, no,
use.
that's
that
the
if you-
problem is
You cut us down, we ain't water to
You're
grass.
one of the ones that actually run up to that limit.
Right.
Yeah.
So the reason why some of the permits are higher is because they were flood watering and they're growing multiple vegetable crops here. So whenever you flood water, you run it down that ditch, you run it down that road. I mean, most time whenever we did it, you're 6 inches, right, Curtis? I mean,
Oh, easy.
I mean, if you get away with 4, you hit a home run.
Yeah.
4 inches at a time, and that lasts about 10 days. Well, now with a pivot, a good rule of thumb on a pivot is you want to be around and put on 1 inch in 3 days, 72 hours, to keep up with dryness. So that's what I'm saying, that is the big, so you're seeing how some aren't using, you say they're not using it, it's because they put a pivot up and they're like way more efficient.
I've heard that
You know what I mean?
have had, you're
That's
really
what-
efficient, you've got
Well,
high-tech
well,
stuff
that's
and
what
all
I'm
this.
saying, but that's,
I got that.
that's
but-
where Dr. Bill's coming from, some of these permits are high from historical use, yes.
We've covered.
Because they proved it back in the day, whenever I wasn't even here, they did it, okay? So we're operating under those rules, and those pivots make it more efficient, and that's what.
And you only get 75% of your acres out of a covered brick,
Yeah,
square.
you're not even farming the corners.
You lose all
You're
those corners,
keeping
so we
that.
cut ourselves back 25% already, for
Yeah.
sure.
Without even doing anything.
Yeah, well, just
without
putting the
doing it.
pivot up.
Yeah.
And then we save
from
water
the
by
permitted amount,
pumping
not the use.
with
But
pivots.
you didn't get to finish your answer about what would a good baseline be to work from, because you started to explain the difference in permits, but we understand that. But what would be a good way to calculate a baseline?
There's a lot of, there's so much legal part of that I'm not sure I could answer it by myself. Because how you define, I don't fully appreciate and understand some of the stuff that I've heard Greg explain about how you would define equal treatment. Because people are situated differently with respect to their use relative to their permit limit. And someone who hasn't used their water at all for a long time, what if they start using it? I mean, it's a difficult question that you have to tackle. And so, as an interim step, that's why I suggested in September, consider a voluntary program to at least get things rolling and see how that works.
It hasn't
Because,
worked.
well,
I think they did it in the spring, it's dry again now.
I don't know. I was, I'm just trying to say,
What about?
that was sort of, in a lot of programs, even the city and the Fort Clark mud drought plans, their starting point is voluntary, not
Whether it's
immediate
voluntary or
cut.
not, what would be something, you can't suggest anything that you're thinking might be a
Well, like I said,
possibility?
everyone is situated differently. So if you did some sort of previous 2 or 3 year thing like you had put together, that's a way to do it. I didn't feel comfortable enough, and I didn't include it in the presentation, because that's something Greg would have to weigh in on in terms of how that would be viewed in terms of the board's position relative to litigation that may come out as a result of this.
But
That's
you don't
the
have
biggest-
any suggestion on
I mean,
possibility?
common sense says you base it on some period of previous use. But how you would go about doing that, especially in light of Fort Clark, I don't know.
That's the
That's where it gets
problem with that.
complicated.
The Fort Clark issue separately, but you're thinking the previous uses make sense.
Well, it's clearly better, well, I pointed out in September that doing it based on permits would be meaningless. That thing you all put together, you know, earlier last year, you know, I pointed out that if you applied that strictly on the permit limits, it wouldn't change anything. You know, so
I mean, I
you'd
personally,
have to do it based on
I
some.
personally spent $600,000 just to improve my water system. There were 3 new pumps, all new pivots,
Yeah,
to be the most efficient I could possibly be with that water. And now, I'm gonna get hurt because I didn't pump all that water that I could.
I mean, how close do you get to your permit, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, well, the thing of it is, half my permit is not owned by me. Okay?
See, that's the other problem.
We're moving. Anything else from presentation?
You're getting into a can of worms I don't think you wanna get into.
I don't
That's
mind.
all I'm saying, because there's a lot of absentee people right here that are gonna throw one fit.
somebody
There's
asked me,
people living here full-time who are throwing a fit now because they're.
Hey, hey.
I'll leave
I'm
on,
just saying.
Come on.
I'll leave on a positive note,
Sometimes people throw money
if
at
I
it.
may.
Well, I don't know.
Let's let
Well,
it
some do, not me, but.
Well, I'm not saying you, I'm
Yeah,
not
Come
against
on,
it.
enough.
I'll leave on a positive note if I can. Somebody asked me about, you know, it's now April, have we shut the window on getting any good rain? So just like I did the statistical analysis on spring flow, I did it on rainfall too, in that memo from last June. This tells us that May is the big month. You all know that.
Great.
But
Great,
for
it's probably more
others,
powerful.
the window is not closed. We still might get a good rain in May to kind of help mitigate and alleviate some of these problems. And then, of course, we're on a bimodal system, so September's the next good look. So, like I said, trying to leave on a positive note that we're not out of the biggest rain month yet. So
I can pray for rain.
pray for rain.
Dr. Hutchison, how do we get to your Google Drive? You said you had that Google Drive and there's
The presentation-
there's a website yesterday.
The presentation that I did last night has all the links.
And that's,
And has it been posted yet, Janelle?
Everybody in this county is.
As the president, he was asking if the presentation's been posted yet.
Yes.
Last
It's
night.
been posted, so if you go to you can download the presentation and all of those links are there, so you can go get whatever you want.
thank you.
Hey, Bill, before you get into mine, can you leave your correlation, your City Well 1 correlation?
They're still up. You wanna start with that?
Yeah, can we start with that? Just because I'm gonna have a couple of quick slides, but, so City Well 1, Tula Rosa, and then Dooley. And I just wanna see the polynomial on Dooley.
Oh, Dooley?
Oh, no, you can start there, let's go the other way, that's fine. So City Well 1, linear correlation, this is probably the best out of all of them, is that right? I know we didn't have data at the time for Fort Clark mud, but that would also be very similar to
Presumably,
this.
I would fully expect that to be,
So, and then, City Well number 2, at the time we did this, we did not
we
have
didn't have
data,
data.
but similar to this.
I would expect that.
Okay, and then so Tula Rosa, this is GMA 10, this is up to 334 Tula Rosa Road. Again, a linear correlation. And then the next one, Dooley. Dooley, it's a polynomial, a little more complex correlation than a linear,
But it correlates.
but it correlates. I would agree, but it's not just one-to-one, it's
Correct.
polynomial. As the aquifer raises and lowers, it could change the correlation.
Yeah, we talked about linearity yesterday.
Yeah, linear, this is one that would not be linear. The other ones.
This is
yeah.
where you get in trouble if you just assume everything's
If you
linear.
assume everything's linear, you're gonna get in trouble. So the correlation with Dooley is not linear.
Correct.
Okay.
The coefficient would change, the correlation stays the same. They're addressing me on the next one.
Will.
If you could start me off and I'll, because I just have a couple graphs I want to show, just based on some information I presented last night. And I've been in the field all day, I apologize for the attire.
No, sit over there. He's talking.
Next.
He's having way too much. Yeah, right. We got here until late last night, excuse me. Okay, just real quick. So last night, I showed you this graph. And it was the spring. We've been very fortunate. In December of last year, we were able to put an instrument in the natural spring basin of Las Moras Spring. And up until essentially right before Easter, everything was moving along fine. Other than presenting it last night, I wasn't aware of what happened. I was under the impression that operations had been going as normal, and then something happened, but the spring started to go down. Last night I was informed, I think Jason, you and John or somebody had indicated to me that what happened at this event is that there was not enough water in the spring to fill the pool, so what they did is they used mud well number 1 to fill the recreational pool. And so what I did this morning, before I came into the office here, is I went back and looked at, okay, let's look at mud well number 1, let's look at mud well number 2, let's look at city well number 1, let's look at city well number 2. And so this is mud well number 2. This is what Bill was talking about before. If you see this, see the little blips going up and down, this is what has been happening normally, is that, it's pumping, but it's just kind of going up and down. When there was an event that was not normal, the pumping of 3 acre-feet from mud well number 1, this is what happened to mud well number 2. City well number 1 is right here by the yard, the same thing. We're going to normal, something else happened. There's a direct correlation with the spring flow going down, mud well 2 number started going down, city well number 1. City well number 2, the same thing. I talked about that all these, this is 1481. This is 1,481 feet. The other wells are about 1,000 feet. The spring water is coming up from about 1,000. It's all tapping into the same spot. This water, something happened that we've not been able to see before. We've been asking to put sensors in the city well and mud and the spring for the last several years. Well, we just recently have been able to do that. Now what we see is where there was an event that happened that was abnormal to what we normally do. We saw a direct result to spring reduction, and the spring went from about 10 feet to now it's down to about 6. And all in one event, and that took 3 acre-feet from these wells. That's all I wanted to say.
We also know that in previous years, in 2022, 2023, and maybe in 2021, but I am not sure on that, there was a similar nosedive in spring level, not depth to water, but visibly the spring dropped. So in those instances, there wasn't pumping from the city well to fill the pool necessarily. There might have been some of those years, but not every single year on the same date when it started.
What you're not accounting for is that those 3 wells right there are about 1,100 acre-feet a year. So that's about, 500,000 gallons a day.
Yeah, over the year, but we're talking about a phenomenon where the spring flow drops in a short period of
So
time.
if
That
it's
happened
I mean,
regardless
the spring
of-
flow was already down to 0.
Yeah, that
Right,
happened in
so-
past
right,
years.
so it was already 0.
But you depressurize the aquifer.
So we
Right,
drained
and
down
so
the
water
holding
drains.
pond.
So Gage, if the city if it's real warm and the city pumps more water, it's having an impact on the spring. If mud decides that we're gonna connect to a fire hydrant and go do something else, or something breaks and there's lossages, it has a direct result in the spring, and that correlation is linear. Okay, there may be correlation with the dually, but it's a polynomial. It's not linear. It's a little more complex. So if water raised in the aquifer, it may not respond the same every time.
But it still responds. It has a
Well, you know
relationship to the
what?
spring.
That's what we're looking at. And you know what? And I heard earlier you kept talking about the Austin Chalk. I mean, look at someone like the Shocks. They've got wells that are 125 feet deep in the Austin Chalk, and that's not impacting spring flow. If that well he pumps, it's going to come off.
Can you say that conclusively?
Yes.
Dr. Bill, can he say conclusively that Austin Chalk is not going to have an impact on spring flow?
That's
a big claim.
That's not what I said. And I didn't say Austin Chalk. I talked about some specific wells.
I go
Just
back to
now
what
you
I
said.
said earlier, get the wells away from the springs and you'll be fine.
I thought you said Austin Chalk too, but
No, I don't, well, some specific wells that are in the Austin Chalk are not having an impact on spring flow.
That you can measure.
That,
Farther away.
you're not, they're not being pumped hard enough to induce a pressure change from the Edwards.
Okay,
As
so
much
if
as
they
you
were
possibly
pumped harder,
can.
they could.
No, there's not enough water in, the wells that I'm talking about specifically, there's not enough water to pump them hard.
That's why water would come in from the Edwards and fill that.
The Edwards is way down
Suggest
below.
We run a
But
pipeline from
Hutchison's
somewhere
picture usually
several
is
miles
water.
away from the spring and bring water in.
If you wanna have.
This is, listen, I don't wanna.
I just wanna make sure you
Hey, guys, look.
Can we clarify for the record
I know, we're just talking.
what
just
the
looking at where
event
it
was?
was.
And
We're getting
making
along.
sure
Yeah.
that you understand with, Jason's, what you learned from, this event that we're talking about that caused this drop. So on whatever day that was, it was on or about March 28th, that the pool was drained, like it's been for years. The pool was drained. The pumps are in the pool and they put the water back into the spring to empty the pool to clean it. As soon as the pool was emptied and those pumps were shut off that empty the pool, that's what causes the spike in the spring sensor.
Right.
That happened and you see that all the
That
time.
happened every time.
But after and before the water was bought and pumped from the mud well, the spring was below the level that it would fill the pool. The event was not the filling of the pool. The event was the pool was drained, and then after it was drained, the spring went to zero. It wasn't that the pumping put the spring below zero to get into the pool. After the pool was drained, the spring was too low to put any water into the pool naturally.
I
So the
think-
decision was made to buy water, but that was after the spring was not high enough to fill the pool.
That's correct. I would agree with that, that there was not enough water in the spring to move it into the pool, and so therefore you needed to pump if you wanted to fill the pool.
And that was the event that we
That's-
don't know what caused that. Before the pool was drained, the water was high enough because it was at 2 CFS or whatever the level was before that date. And then it went to zero right after the pool was drained. But
Is that-
before it was filled.
I'm gonna turn to Jason.
What's the question?
Is when the pool was drained, we're getting into semantics here, I don't know if we wanna get
I'll
into
tell you
this,
the best
but,
of my knowledge.
okay, when the pool was drained, the water level of the natural spring base, the algae, you couldn't,
The retention pond, let's
Right.
call, where you installed the sensor,
Right.
was filthy, slimy. The flow had reduced to where it wasn't coming through the pool. It wasn't coming over the gate. It was done.
Right.
All right. So we did not want to take water from that dirty water, get it into the pool. So then we pumped all the water out of the pool, pressure washed it, and bought $600, 3 acre-feet of water from mud, and filled the pool.
That's
Now-
my understanding.
Now,
That's
what happened.
the already drained down water table, by pumping another 3 acre-feet directly do it, there's nothing to refill it, because it's already tapped down to nothing. So, yeah, so that maybe drowned it out a bit. There
well,
was
I'm gonna
nothing
go back to
replace
Dr.
it.
Hold on.
Let's focus on this chart. This is the new instrument that you've put in the spring bed itself.
right, it's at the bottom of the string
In
retention.
the past, this is showing basically when the spring was so low, it was essentially less than 1 CFS early in the graph.
Right.
Okay? What happened here is if this instrument had not been there, the gauge would show 0. 0, 0, 0, 0.
This would have
And we
been
would have
zero
never
almost
seen-
all the way.
We
from
would
the
have
beginning.
never seen this response.
Right.
The fact that you put this in, this is at 0 flow in the spring, but now we have the ability to look at the actual head in the spring and see how much did it drop? 4 feet?
I mean, we saw it every time, we
Something
just
like
didn't
that.
have data points to back
Yeah,
it up,
that-
but everybody
that's
watched
the
it drop
point. That's-
crazily.
Jason, that's the exact point. We never had the data
Right.
to do this
Understand
kind
what
of
it's-
analysis before.
Right.
But by having this instrument in there, we can see it.
Dr. Hutchison, this mostly for you, I guess. there's been talk about town about if the gates at the spring head that we're seeing here, where this instrument is, if the gate was fully open to let the level of the pond drop to a natural level that would go down the spillway, how would that affect spring flow over the long term? So that would essentially lower the hydraulic head above the spring by
You're not
3
retaining
feet.
enough water, I think is what you're saying. I mean,
No,
you're not
what if-
retaining.
There are people that have suggested it would be better for the long-term health of the creek if that gate was left open, lowering the head on the spring over the long term. Does it affect the spring over the long term if that gate that can modify
3
the
foot of
pressure
water.
above the spring, it would change it by about 2 feet or whatever?
3 feet, I think.
Would that make any difference?
From a hydrogeologic standpoint, probably not. But what you're talking about is essentially an engineering work to, whenever something like that is built, I know you don't like this, but it's based on certain objectives. You know, why did they build that the way they did back in the day? I don't know. If you went to change it, what would the unintended consequences of that be? That's something that, but whether you did it or not, I don't think the actual spring would be impacted. Because at that point, if the spring is above whatever elevation you leave it with, that water's gonna run out. If you change the elevation, well, that doesn't affect anything down below that's pushing the water up.
Yeah, I don't know. I remember back in the day, I was on the board on the Ford back in the 2000s when Joe Goebel was around.
Yeah.
And I don't know what his qualifications were, and I remember meeting him at the spring and talking to him all the time about it, but his contention back in the day was the fort needs to keep it as high as possible, which is actually better for the long-term health because it keeps water in the ground, and then over time it would average out better. But there's people that say, open the floodgate and lower it 3 feet, and then that's better. So I don't know what's better.
My experience with this sort of thing revolves around the Owens Valley. And the engineers for LA at that point, they jealously guarded their hydraulic structures. And suggestions of making changes to achieve some of their objectives, like what you're talking about, they always pointed out why the structure was built the way it was. And like I said, this is a gap in my knowledge here, why the structure was built that way. But I don't think wherever that head is, I mean, it's like the Dooley well. They got a 9-10 foot standpipe, and the water level comes way up above ground. And that's a good thing for us because we can monitor when it's above ground and we see fluctuations in that water level. It'd be a similar kind of thing here, so it wouldn't have any effect on the groundwater flow, the ability for the spring to continue to, have pressure and flow out at that point.
Okay.
I don't think that would be a consideration one way or the other. There may be reasons to leave it the way it is. There may be reasons to fix it the way you're doing it. That's a totally separate discussion relative to managing the pool.
Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
So I just wanted to clarify, so that this precipitous event that caused that sudden drop, and then it was corresponding in the mud well and in both of the city wells, there was a drop at the same time, if I'm understanding
Right.
correctly, but that was not because of them filling the pool from mud water, was that it was something else that
Well,
happened? Some other
You know what, I
event
probably
that we
apologize,
don't
I
know?
probably didn't explain this correctly. Because there was not enough water in the natural spring.
Right.
For whatever reason, both sides are on here, but there was not enough water in the spring. They had to utilize a well that is normally utilized just to provide the fort with drinking water.
Right, the mud,
The
right,
mud
the
well,
mud
mud
well.
one. They had to utilize that. That was different than any other operation that we had seen in the history of this particular instrument. So that's an event for me, like I presented last night. I thought it was something, they did something with the spring, and I was corrected, like, no, that's not what we did, we pumped. So then today I went back, okay, let's look at all the other data. Did anything else happen? Well, what happened in the other ones was this one, the same time. The mud well 2 is actually closer to the spring, right next to mud well 1. There's about 50 feet apart. City well number 1 is right here in the yard, right behind us. And then city well number 2 is the one right up here by the water tower. Almost instantaneously, when you start doing something different, something changed. And all I'm doing is presenting the information. And Jason, this is the same data you get.
So let's say what mud well pumps what 700 acre feet, 800 acre feet.
600 acre feet.
So
a year.
let's say 2 acre feet a day. Pool's 3 acre feet. Takes about three days to fill that thing with the tiny hose that we have. So we pump 3 acre feet for 3 days instead of 2 acre feet for 3 days. And I don't see how that would totally top down the whole
well, and you know what? Somehow there's a difference.
Because
somehow,
we're already on the bottom and things are going down, 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 down.
So Jason,
Well,
I got a question.
Jason,
So
Jason,
how much did your flow?
Jason, this was when, remember I talked about, I didn't want to steal Jim's thunder.
No, that's okay,
But I
bud.
use this as the example of measurable, attributable, and significant.
No.
Okay? This is measurable.
Right.
This event, you can measure it. We've got the data that measures it. Attributable. Everything suggests that this was due to the pumping, the additional pumping of number 2.
At least in part, but perhaps not totally. Correct?
Well,
Is that
you
true
know,
or not?
Let them finish.
When you're talking about attributable, you're talking about, there's all sorts of other variables. The eclipse may have had an effect. Who the hell knows? The point is that these blips on these graphs suggest that the pumping of number 2 caused that drop. Okay? Now, once you've established those two, and what you were just arguing, Jason, is it significant? Hell no. This is more interesting than significant. This suggests that we have some better understanding, and to your point, these wells are real close to the spring.
Right.
This is supporting the concept that pumping near the spring affects the spring.
Right.
No more, no less. It's not significant in any sense because these numbers, hell, we're not gonna run out of water when the damn well's 8 feet below ground.
Yeah, no,
The water level is 8 feet below the ground.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, and it's part of what we do to gain an understanding of how this works. So I don't, by putting this up here, we're not saying this is the end of the world or anything else. It simply says this is data that supports the concept that pumping nearby has an effect. If you needed to pump it again to fill the pool again, it's no problem. Do it.
Yeah.
Actually, Mud says no.
Well,
Says their stuff's too low now.
Wouldn't it be wise to get further away from the springs? And maybe, there's 2 places we could go to. We could go to the gravel
clearly.
for Fort Clark, or we could go up here to Pinto Valley. And I know it doesn't sound like it's money, but if you want your cake and eat it too,
Director Blake.
that's what you need to do.
Director Blake thinks, we ought to do the Austin Chop.
But there you go.
I mean, there's.
And that's to fill the pool, which
No,
is.
that's just to get the water from the major pumping that's around the springs. That's what's affecting the springs.
So replace mud with a new mud.
Just
that
get
comes
away from the springs and
Well,
it's gonna level out. It's gonna be leveler
Can
than
we
that.
get some of you guys permits?
here's another.
I don't care. I'll give you some water.
Here's another
You
alternative.
solved the whole problem now.
Here's another alternative we talked about last September.
Better get cut back.
Okay, you know where does Del Rio get its water from?
Hampstead.
San Felipe Spring.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, they just take water out of the spring after it flows out.
Okay.
They do, see if they have a surface
And that's
water.
kind of what's happening with the gravel
They
now.
have a surface water treatment plant, and they use that water. They don't pump groundwater. Now, they have looked at the opportunities as a drought protection measure to drill wells and do that, but their situation is totally different because that spring is fed with Lake Amistad. As long as Lake Amistad has water, water's gonna be squirting out of San Felipe. So, like you're saying, move the pumping away. Another option would be if the Brackett and Fort Clark went to surface water treatment, then they could use spring flow a lot of the time, a lot of years, and only pump during dry years when the spring flow is inadequate. That would alleviate.
We
some
have
of the
great
problem.
water.
So there's
We have
lots
great
of
water.
there's lots of options. Unfortunately, a lot of them cost money.
I have a question. If it is the city well and mud well use, and that's for residential use, which is pretty stable year-round, yet the springs only drop whenever we hit April or May, then how is that solely attributed to pumping from those
Well,
wells?
your assumption is incorrect.
Yeah, it's not.
Municipal supply is not a steady number. It rises and falls with the
In the
seasons.
winter, you use less.
Yeah.
In the summer, you use more.
And we've got Nora has them, but
Landscape irrigation uses a lot of water.
We've got all the
That
numbers.
goes just like
It's
the other
absolutely
irrigation.
seasonal. This time of year, you're beginning to pump more.
So Jason, on
I'm
your
not
point on the
saying
well,
pump.
so how much does
Pardon?
that well pump a minute normally whenever it's pumping, not into the pool?
I don't know,
There's no meter?
but it's like 600 acre feet a day, I mean, a year, so a couple acre feet a
Okay,
day.
because the reason why I'm asking is because you can stress a well, and by you opening that valve, that keeping that valve open, supplying the fort, it's gonna suck it down, it's gonna have more drawdown.
Yeah.
Well, we can
Just
see
for
it.
an instance, we had a well go down on last Thursday, so we had to tie two wells together to go to a different pivot that's nozzled for more than the original pivot that it's usually at. So it's usually, it pumps 1,200 a minute, but if you push it, it'll do 1,400. So we had to push it, but after 2 days of pumping, it starts dropping
Yeah.
because you're stressing it. Now, it took it about 24 hours to come back, and it came back. But that's what I'm saying, whenever you open that valve,
Yeah, you're probably
you know
gonna
what I mean,
see a
you're
rebound.
putting more gallons out per
You'll
minute.
probably see a
out of
rebound
that
after
well.
this dip. You'll probably see a rebound.
Curtis, you're right.
Because you're pulling
But
more
it
out.
might be a
Potentially,
little
absolutely.
lower.
You're pulling more out a minute,
Yep.
just to explain it.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Well,
Any other questions?
Oh, Ms.
Questions,
Marsh,
not
hang on.
statements.
Mr. Gaines, I'm sorry, Ms. Marsh had her hand up.
Oh, I didn't see
Oh,
it.
no, I already asked what I wanted.
Okay, all right,
Thank
thank
you,
you very
ma'am.
much.
I have a
What?
question, will this, information be part of the packet that the
It's-
board gets each month? Or will it be
It's-
somewhere else available?
It is every,
I think it was in there.
it's
It was in
already,
there
it's in
yesterday.
every month. It's been included every month since December. It's in the packets.
Okay, it'll be in the packet every month, like an update of where that
No,
is.
that's not what I just said. It has, what's?
How can I find this,
Um,
as we get more data on this graph?
I'm gonna
where
have
can
a
I find
graph
it?
in the gauge.
Jason
I'm gonna
gets it
make
every day.
I'm gonna make it
Jason
live.
gets it 4 times a
Almost
day.
have it ready.
Okay, Jason
I can
has it
show you on my
4 times a
phone
day.
right now, the number.
Jason, hang on a second.
Okay.
This is the information that we have all been talking about, that once the website is up, all this information is gonna be available. Right now, because it's on the fort, he gets it every day. This is the same data he gets every day.
I can only get it from Jason.
I'm gonna publish it for you. and the
Oh
district
my
may
God,
publish
that
it
is
for you.
not what I just said. I mean, it's available with the district has
Okay,
it.
thank you.
I don't know, is there government funding for municipalities?
We're not a municipality,
No.
which is the
Oh,
disconnect.
oh.
We're not a taxing authority, we're
Sorry.
we're private property, and that's makes everything more
Oh,
complicated.
we do have taxes.
The water losses, to pump it from, the difference in the water losses, I think is where you're going, to be able, if you take a million gallons out of the spring and put it somewhere, that's 1 million gallons. If you take 1 million gallons out of the ground and run it through a distribution system and pipelines and infrastructure, and then it needs to be 1 million at the end, there are losses in between that makes it more.
All right. I think we have seen that there's no simple answer to this. In terms of moving ahead, what I would like, just, start with the basic question, are we gonna present a plan? Yes or no? Right? If the answer to that is no, nothing, each individual, I want that answered. If the answer is no, I guess nothing further needs to be done. If the answer is yes, then talking about a trigger, Dr. Bill talked, he suggested 3, different things to look at here. It was all based on spring flow. I guess there could be other triggers that someone might suggest, correlation with some of the wells, et cetera. The next time we get together, I want to answer, yes, no, trigger, and then, what we do from that. David, what you came up with was, in my opinion, a little too complicated. I mean, the various, stages and stuff, we may wind up with that in front of the board, but, I would simplify.
Welcome suggestions.
Or isn't it complicated
I
to
would,
accommodate everyone?
I would, you know,
Try to simplify.
I really would.
Okay.
I mean, it's almost a, you know, on-off switch, or at most, I mean, there's a switch 1, switch 2.
Take a look at it.
You know, see on that. But, you know, bring something to the table. I don't think that, you know, stretching this out is gonna change anything. I think it's time to fish or cut bait. You know, let's put something together over the next meeting or two to present to the board and let them run with. Hopefully by then, Dr. Bill, I mean, like at the zone 1, 2, 3.
Well, that's what I was saying, with the zones,
Yeah.
we got the different triggers, and yet he just told me they were still monitored, you know.
I can't.
I don't see how you can have that until you have that information.
I can't speak for the board. I won't speak for the board.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is damn logical.
Or
I
if
mean,
the zones
you know, in
change,
other
the
words, you know,
same plan will be
if
approved.
that information is coming over the next 2 months, didn't you say May, possibly, June at the latest? The geologic,
The geologic work will be done in May,
And-
and that has nothing to do with this.
well, but if you could, you know, perhaps based on that, you know, update, you know, your zone 1, 2, 3, given what we're looking at now. You said that when you did it before, it was a different consideration.
Right.
Now that you know what's in, you know, what's up for discussion now, if you could revisit zone 1, 2, 3,
Yes, sir.
and, you know, and, because I agree with you. I mean, if that's fluid, I don't see the board, I mean, again, it's my opinion, I don't see the board doing something to, yeah,
Well, that's
until we get to more zone 1, 2, 3 info. Yes, sir.
I would like to hear from Greg, especially about the legal side, because
Yeah.
everybody thinks we can do just whatever we want, but
Oh, no,
legally,
no,
it's
no,
a big
we-
deal.
yeah.
Number two, I think we need to know where those faults are.
Well, but that's part of what he's
Yeah.
coming up
That's
with.
part of the.
Okay, and I think you gotta make a sound decision. You can't just say, well, we're gonna change it down the road. I don't think.
No,
that's-
no,
I don't
no,
think
no,
that's,
no,
I think
no.
we need to make some solid decisions.
No,
Whatever we do.
not change it down the road.
Right. Well,
The problem,
Haste makes waste, you know?
nah,
If you hate, go into something.
you're missing the point. We've discussed several times about a finish the crop situation, okay? We're well into growing season.
Right.
All right, so, I mean, in essence,
Well, the Edwards-
we have, you know, the old haste thing. I mean, if we decide on something tomorrow, it's not gonna be implemented until after a growing
Even
season.
finish the crop's gonna be complicated, just because of hay growing.
No, it is.
Yeah,
It is. It depends on the crop, the time of
Yeah.
year.
But I'm just saying,
But
I know everybody thinks us farmers are just sucking everything dry. I don't believe that. I don't believe
that's,
for a minute, 'cause
that's
we-
not, move
That's
on,
just-
move on.
okay.
You know, put that in your proposal.
Okay.
What are you saying, Charlie? What are you thinking in terms of how many more meetings, how much more time?
I
What's on
don't-
your mind?
I think in, you know, 1 to 2 meetings, I mean, if we're gonna put proposals together, I think we ought to be able to do it 1 or 2 meetings.
Okay, and when would that be?
Yeah, I have a calendar. I guess the question is, I mean, I would like to meet certainly before the next board meeting. The only question is, we meet once or twice.
I would like to see an option of me somehow financially being able to move the wells further away. That would be my first proposal
Well,
to the board.
but again, that's not a rules deal.
No, but
Right. That's-
if you're
that's-
worried about spring flow and you wanna have your cake and
But-
eat it too,
We can't, I mean,
because we can go through all this and we keep pumping right next to those springs, we're probably not gonna see what we wanna see.
and
In my view.
that has, if you've watched the board meetings, that has been discussed a time or two.
Okay.
You know, Blake Ward, you know, give him credit for trying to think ahead, but
Right.
6, 8, 10 months ago,
Right.
you know, he said, you know, can we, the board, can the district, can we contribute money to drilling wells out on, you know, the far edge of Fort Clark? You know, he was under the impression that was a different formation or something, it wouldn't directly affect the spring. You know, pay to, you know, pipe that over here and then keep City Well 1 and 2, Mud Well 1 and 2, whatever, as kind of backup, but try to shift some of the suck out
Especially
there
in the dry
and see what happens. I think it's damn worth looking at myself. It's
We know that.
it's been kicked around, but again, we can't do that. You know, we have to have an
It's no
okay
use
from the.
imposing something that doesn't work.
Well, we look into it, if there's a chance that it worked, then we gotta look at permission, funding, et cetera. I have no idea what it costs, but I do think it's worth looking into.
It'll be a lot.
But that's not what this rules committee is doing. Right?
Charlie?
In terms of calendar, yes, ma'am.
Just one quick question, that I'm sorry, I don't want to get into the calendar, but when you look at the rules as a whole, I was looking at them again today, and beyond the question of a drought plan, there are some other things, like I believe it's section 4.04 that talks about the reporting, and as of right now, that section still states that it will be an annual report due on January 15th. And my understanding is that, we've been talking for, 2 years now since I've been coming to these meetings about monthly reporting. So I would think that, I don't know if the board is gonna do that separately from the scope of this rules committee, but I would think that we would be changing that
Where'd
section.
Jim go?
Right here, sir.
Yes.
To reflect what you guys are doing now.
How often are we getting reports now?
Well, Ms. Marsh is exactly correct. In 404, you have annual reports that are submitted annually. They need to give monthly values, but they're reported annually.
But what, with the monitoring and what Marty's doing, are we getting the data more often, or are we still
Well,
relying on the
we've started to, but that's, we're 2 months in or 3
Well,
months in
I
the
know,
year. Right.
but are we getting it more often?
Not from the pumpers. So,
They go out there and look.
Irrigators, man, irrigators.
Sorry, I'm sorry if I use a term. Now, I will say, Mr. Bain, Mr. Sadoff, Mr. Carpenter, he's not here, have been texting me and giving me their information on a regular basis. But there's not a formal process set up right now where each of the producers are providing a report.
Marty, they're not that many wells. Is that something, how often do you visit them, or is that, but is that something we do through the rules? I'm not even sure on that.
That was
Well, it's
brought
in-
up
Or
at
is that
the
just?
first meeting,
is
that was
just
brought up.
asking you?
That's why I thought-
That was brought up at the first meeting.
Right.
You said that was part of what we were gonna do. We were still finishing up visiting all the wells. We have visited all the wells and everything.
Okay.
So now it's up to y'all to decide what's
Okay.
gonna be.
Director Gaines, I'm sorry, I think Ms. Marsh is right, though, that if this body wants to recommend a rule change under 404, this would be the place to do it.
No, that's true,
Yeah.
true. What I'm asking y'all is it practical to ask for a monthly report? Is it practical for you to?
I'd rather them go out there and look at it, so then you know everything's factual and everything's right.
Is there certain wells you want us?
Is it?
Well, that's what I'm asking you, because at the beginning you had said, well, we're gonna decide which wells we're gonna visit at a
Well, but
monthly,
that's-
like the higher pumping wells, or
Now that you've been on the ground a couple, 3 months.
there's not that many wells that are being pumped. That's what I'm saying is, we gave the information and
So
stuff.
getting monthly data, is that a doable deal?
Oh, yeah, I can go out monthly.
Good point. Then, yeah, so yes, that,
Well,
that
most
would
of
be,
the time,
that might be
the
part of
wells
the
on our pivot
recommendation.
might be a problem getting there some days.
I don't mean to interject, but there are other things, using the meters, and there were some things about approved vendors and stuff, and if that gets into, I don't know if that's been discussed at all. Lance, have they talked about FieldNet or anything like that in this part of this thing, but just,
monitors it, so.
yeah, but allowing, like, on some of the wells, there's not a meter, sulfur water, bad water, a meter itself, but it's being reported electronically with the time you pump, the volume you pump, the time you stop, and then the time you pump again. And I think that's an approved method, I don't know, but if that's something that needs to be addressed in the rules, that should be something that could be discussed. Ideally, everybody would do it like that, but I know that's not feasible, so.
They were supposed to all have meters. All the permits that were issued with the contingency in that hearing report that meters would be installed.
Metered or an appropriate method of
Well,
measurement.
if the rules
Approved.
can change, then I'm not unaware of that.
That's this would be the point.
That can be part of the recommendation, yeah. But that's just,
problem is
That's
finding
relatively
a meter
not
that'll hold
controversial.
up in the sulfur water.
So the controversial stuff, looking at the calendar, we're gonna meet once. I would like to meet at least once before the next one. Next board meeting is on May 8th. I guess Nora still have the city stuff on Tuesday.
I don't know, I have elections, so I need to take a look at the Secretary of State website to see when I will be doing my canvassing, if it changes again. I need to change it, but I will let you know tomorrow morning.
But usually Mondays are okay?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I would suggest it would be Monday, the 6th of May. And if anybody want to meet prior to that, or is that okay?
I'd rather not meet twice.
Okay. If y'all don't mind, let's put
It'd
down
be
Monday.
probably nicer if we met right before the board meeting.
Well, that's 2 days before.
No, but I mean, for me, for travel and all that, if we did it the same day, I could get her at whatever time, then go to the board meeting.
That would be better for me too, then.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is, board meeting's at 6.
You did
I mean,
4.
I have a meeting at
Well-
6 on Monday though, which I'm still person.
you know, I know, Vic had trouble getting over. I don't mind meeting on that Wednesday. I mean, I'm coming from Houston generally.
And that's
or
Wednesday.
East
Wednesday
Texas,
is right.
What day is the board meeting?
8th.
The 8th?
It's Wednesday, the 8th.
I mean, it would cut down on drive time and, you know, I don't mind staying 4 or 5 hours. And I wanna go to the board meeting too, so I like to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, to tell you the truth. That's just my preference, I don't know what
Okay.
everybody else.
So meet at 4 o'clock on Wednesday. I mean, here.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
All right. We'll meet at 4 on Wednesday, the 8th. Board meeting to follow at 6. And bring your proposals. Thank y'all. Dr. Bell, Jim, thank y'all.
Thank y'all.
And